Good morning, everybody. Welcome to our session this morning. I know you're really fresh from your break from the keynotes today. Welcome to the curious case of the disappearing and other strange happenings with SCIM. I'm Janelle Allen, and I'm a product manager with Webex Identity. I'm also on the SCIM working group with IETF on the newly formed group, and we're investigating the new next phase of the SCIM standard, the SCIM spec. And I'm also on the board of ID Pro, the Identity of Association Professionals, and I'm newly elected treasurer there. My colleague, Qingwen.
Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Qingwen Cheng. I'm a principal engineer and architect for Cisco Webex Identity team. Our team has been supporting Cisco collaboration services. During the years of support, we often encounter customer issues about user life cycle and state management. So those are, I think, common problem all service providers are facing. We have some homegrown solution, but it'd be great if we can have a standardized solution for among all service providers as part of the standard, and then this will ensure us to have better customer behavior across the boundary. Okay.
Thank you. Today we're really looking into some particulars with SCIM. We're taking a case of what is existing in the existing spec and some of the difficulties we at Webex have seen regarding the existing standard. We operate as a service provider, which might be unique amongst many people here. Companies might be identity providers. And we've noticed some interesting things regarding disappearing identities and some interesting things regarding the user lifecycle state in the standard. We have some things that we're going to propose today as how we can augment the standard, and we think that those things could maybe also be tied in with shared signals and events. And so we'd like to cover that with you today. So what can we learn about Stranger Things? And you might not know this, but this boy is my son, and he's actually an Identiverse person. He's been to this conference before, and he's an identity prodigy in the making. And his favorite TV show is Stranger Things. And he thinks that this could help us today. I received his consent to use his image in this presentation for all the identity nodes. And he's happy for us to participate.
He's really stylish. I like his shoes.
So with Webex Identity, you may not know this, or you may know this. We've been part of the SCIM journey since the very beginning as part of the initial standard 1.0. And so we've encountered things along the way that happened even in the very early times. And one of the things we noticed was regarding, disappearing identities. And you might wonder, well, why would you say that? Well, we think that there's some elements that have been introduced to SCIM that came about from SCIM 2.0 based on the REST style of handling APIs. For instance, we know in REST, there's the HTTP delete verb followed by the noun. And we think that very naively think, well, that's great. Let's just go ahead and delete that identity. Oh boy, delete. And at Webex, you delete their data, you delete their meetings, you delete everything. And that's pretty aggressive to handle delete in that way. And there's really no notion in SCIM to handle it differently. The spec says that you don't have to implement a delete. Well, that's a problem too. Then you've got data lingering around in the system, and you may not need that. We have also noticed that there's a variation between how different SCIM clients actually handle the delete operation. And we were actually experiencing quite a bit of frequent erroneous delete events. And so we've actually had to build workarounds in Webex to handle this situation. And we think that really that's unacceptable. We need to improve the standard. And in fact, there was a draft that was put forward for soft delete with SCIM. So we're planning on blowing the dust off of that and really looking at it with fresh eyes for the next version of SCIM. So why do we need a recoverable delete in SCIM? We think it will improve user experience. It's a horrible operation to delete an account and then find out you need to retrieve it from backup tape somewhere, or worse yet, it's just gone and you've lost all the data. So we think we need to be able to persist that data somehow while it's transitioning to a delete. We've looked at, well, what are the features of a recoverable delete anyhow, right? We need to have an ability to kind of indicate that this record is going to be deleted, and then also have an ability to restore it. We also, along that transition, need to keep the history and references along the way, but we still do need a direct delete. Bypass everything right now, gone. We also need the ability to purge those transitioning records over time, and a time delete, and also bulk purge and restores on the delete actions. When we recover or transition a user to a soft or recoverable delete, we also need to be able to exclude them from all global searches that might be happening, but we still need to be able to search for the deleted resources specifically. So those are the features we think that we would need to add for SCIM. But we think that there are a couple ways to handle this.
Yeah, this is so probably two popular approaches in order to solve this recoverable delete problem. Right? First one is soft delete. Soft delete is actually, instead of purging the user permanently from the live user database, we can add a flag to the user entry indicating this is a soft deleted user, and then we have to provide some ways, right? Say, hey, when those users were soft deleted, we don't want the searches to return them in some way, but we do need to have some cases to be able to return them in some fashions, right? That's the typical cases people want to do with soft delete. The pros is pretty obvious. Since the user is not permanently purged, the user is still in the data's informations are still there. It will be very easy to recover them, right? Just one thing's flag, remove flag, just send it across it, so the user can go back live. And for these approaches, we don't also have to send immediate purge to the downstream dependent services, so they don't have to take actions. We have to block them from identity layer, block a user from logging, revoke all the tokens, etc. So those can be handled from, versus the backend can be relaxed. Maybe under 30 days, we can do a hard purge once people confirm, right? So the cons is that, so we have to be careful about searches I mentioned. We need to make sure we don't return those soft deleted user. When in the cases flows, those are not needed. So that's to prevent any mishap from the customer side. The second approach is as archive. So archive approach is basically we move the user from the live user DB to a separate database. It's like Tombstone or separate storage. So those users are separate. So for that one, you can see when you go search the live DB, they will not be returned from the archive. So there are clear separation, and there are separate API can do that. This also solves the typical problem when the compliance officer, right? They want to find the users which deleted a year or two ago, and then you can have a different retention policy. You can keep them for 7, 10 years for those archived users in case people won't go back to look up them, right? So those are the pros for them. In order to recover, we have to move them from the archive DB back to the live. So this might involve some complexity since maybe some refresher integrity between the user and the group has to be restored. So this effort will be much larger than the soft delete. And then, of course, there's separate storage for that. There's a cost associated with that. And temporary to now.
Well, or the answer is it both? And that's the other thing. In SCIM, we never really thought about a notion of an archive. You can imagine, archive user identifier. So maybe there's both is actually required. And especially so, you might not want to archive everything about that user data, but you may not want to recycle events in your system, so being able to store at least the identifier of that user so that you're not recycling that identity if you don't want to do that. At least you'd be able to do that if we implemented some sort of archive. So the moral of this story, sometimes in Stranger Things, we want to bring our favorite characters back from the upside down. And so that is why it's really important that we be able to do that with our identities too. There's some other strange things we've noticed happening in SCIM. In the draft, was defined as part of the core schema an active attribute, and it's a Boolean true, false. And what was really interesting in the standard is that it really doesn't define what that attribute is for really, and it says it's up to the service provider to decide what to do. And that's kind of interesting. We think of it as a rudimentary user state, but it's really not enough context for a service provider to actually know what to do, especially if a client is toggling that flag. What does it mean? And this is especially true when you have many SCIM clients making API calls to a service provider. Now you have to try to figure out what context that might be. So we think we really need to consider what is happening in the enterprise. We know most of us are very familiar with the user lifecycle events that are happening. We've got in the enterprise use case the joiners and their employees that might be hired, and we have the movers and they're transitioning between states. We might have an employee that they're not starting yet. They're about to start soon, but they haven't started yet. So they're maybe going to be in a pending state until they actually do start. Or they might be on leave, or there may be a few other reasons why they have it. But these are very common when you talk in the identity industry. Many organizations are implementing or very much aware of these types of transition states. And then we have the leavers. These employees might be leaving or a contractor's ending. This is quite natural part of the identity lifecycle. But similarly, very similar things are happening in the consumer use cases. We have our joiners. They might be starting their trials or purchasing their free services, or not purchasing, then they might purchase. Also transitioning into various pending states. They might need their email verified before they actually can use their account, or they also could be suspended or transferring. And also they're leaving. The interesting thing in the consumer state is in many jurisdictions, we have to support the right to be forgotten, where they're gone forever. So we have to think about, well, what if we took that active true false flag and we're able to add more meaning? Just like in Stranger Things, the upside down can send us messages to the real world. Why can't we know more too? So what we're proposing is there's very much similarity between these states. We've all been doing it. We just haven't been doing it in a standardized way. So what if we added more context to the states that there are? What if we had more than just a Boolean and had things like introduced a new status called a resource status, and perhaps we added status for an okay state, meaning this isn't a normal use case. And what if there was an active true, but this person's on legal hold, or active true, but they're on leave? Now active true isn't just this green all the time thing. What if it's a false and we added, then we could add more context, such as a reason, like you're on leave, but we're going to add more context, like this user's about to return on such and such date. Similarly, in the false situation, we can add more meaning, like pending in the case that you need more validation or a start date, or fraud, such as we've detected something suspicious happening either at the identity provider or even on the service provider, and we've detected a fraudulent event, actually mark them as fraud. And what about a suspend or even a deleted, okay? So what if we did that? We think that we could just simply add a schema extension to SCIM to handle this, and I'll let Qingwen introduce that.
Yeah, so for all the cases Janelle mentioned, in order for us to get more meaningful and more detailed information about what happened to the user, what things are done on the user, we're proposing to have a schema extension to SCIM. Instead of just a Boolean, we can provide another multi-value attribute indicating the user's state. So there could be canonical values defined with a clear semantic about it. For example, here we talk about pending, this user need verification, this is deleted or suspended or locked, or also in case we don't have the case today, there's something called others who can cover those things. So yeah, we will solicit this state to the other services, and then more of those state can be defined. And more interesting one to note it, it's possible a user could be in multiple of those states. For example, a user could be both logged and put in fraud. So that's could describe about the user state. And also, this could add more reasons, which can be more descriptive about what happens to the user, and this will tell more information about it. So once we have those standard canonical values, and we have a clear semantic attached to that, and each service provider will know what to do when they see that, what happened to the user when they retrieve things from them, and then they can define those actions. So for the later slide, Janelle can go through that. How do we map those canonical state to some actions we're thinking a service provider should perform?
Right. Because as mentioned, now that we have a lot more context, we have a lot more flexibility in what a service provider can actually decide to do. So for instance, I mentioned, well, what if the user was, they're still active, but they're on legal hold? Well, now the service provider could then decide to enable advanced auditing. Now we're going to collect as much data as we can on this user. Or they're on leave. Well, they're on leave. We know that they're maybe coming back at a particular date, but maybe while they're on leave, they still have limited entitlements to certain parts of the service that they're accessing. Think of an employee. They might be gone on leave for a few months and they still get access to email. And same is true for some of these other states, like pending, we're waiting for validation, but we still may create that user account while they're in that state, because we know that those write events are expensive operations. And when an employee is hired in an organization, they're getting access to many services, and that takes time. So it'd be very convenient to be able to just pre-provision those accounts, have them be you're toggling a flag when they actually arrive. Fraud's a very interesting one as well. We could decide to remove the license when we detect that event, decide that they don't get access to the service anymore. So the service provider has a lot more rich ability to now decide to do different things and much more rich context than the simple Boolean that was proposed earlier, this part of the standard. And same is true for the deleted. You could request, this user is going to be deleted on such, or was deleted on this date, or will be deleted on a particular date, and then you can remove a license or delete after X number of days. So what are the benefits of standardizing the state? Well, the service provider can certainly be more informed to take action of what they're going to do. And then we can actually receive some savings on both the service provider side, and for SaaS services that are charging their customers, they can also give their customers some more flexibility too. Like perhaps if you're detecting users and removing their license, you could say, well, we're going to suspend them and remove their license. Their identity stays there, but we're not going to charge them anymore until we decide how we want to handle that later in the life cycle. We can also, free up unnecessary lingering data and resources and make sure that we can improve our security of our system. And then more specifically, by standardizing the states and actually defining them very specifically of what they are, we can have more predictable behaviors across domains. Now it's not so mysterious anymore of what that event is coming in. It's not a false, it might be a false suspend. Okay, great, that's good to know. So with this new proposal of the states, it's really a very interesting thing. And you might say, well, what about shared signals? And what's interesting is that in the SCIM system, what we were talking about before, if a service provider were to change a state, the client would never know. Unless they actually pulled that data, then they would see the state. So we need to add some event handling to SCIM so that maybe we can send some information back. We decided to take a look at what's proposed as part of the risk events as part of shared signals, and it's interesting. They have a handful of states related to identity. There's a credential change request, account enable and disable, account purged, identifier changed, identifier compromised. That account enable disable sounds suspiciously like active true false in SCIM. But what if 11 from Stranger Things came as a superhero and helped us bring these standards together and do a few more interesting things? So let's take a look at SCIM, a SCIM service provider actually sending signals as well. So, we talked about our proposed states before. okay, legal hold or leave, or pending or fraud. And fraud is a particularly interesting case. Like if you were a SCIM client, wouldn't you want to know if your service provider detected a fraud? Probably, so that you could then take corrective action on your side. So the service provider can still do all the things that they would have done previously, but now they can tie in to the shared signals. But the interesting thing about shared signals is that there's not that many of them. And so, account OK, send and enable. But leave or legal hold, is that a disable, or should there be a new signal for that? So that's one of the interesting things with shared signals and trying to put these two things together. Or perhaps we should propose a bunch of new signals for user lifecycle. So that's something that we can think of collectively into the industry as to how we can actually get more out of our user states. The other thing that we can look at is what if we were receiving shared signals as a service provider, which is a little interesting right now if you try to run this experiment. You could get an account enabled. What does that mean? Well, I guess they're okay. What would we do as a service provider? Perhaps match an account. Similar things with the account disable. Maybe we would suspend them and remove a license. But again, there's not a lot of context even in the shared signals today.
Yeah, so for this use case, two-way mapping, it's very practical even within Cisco Webex ecosystem. So for our collaboration offering, we have many services, meetings, chat, etc. So within those, if any user state changes, customer also want to have a consistent behavior among all those applications. For example, if Webex meeting detects a fraudulent activity on a user, they will notify identity system that the user was in fraud. Then we will need to send some changes to the system, basically revoke the tokens and don't allow user logging, and then also broadcast the event to the other services which are interested. So you cannot use chat, you cannot use calendar anymore, right? So that's the one way. The other way is we also want to receive signals from other collaboration service in Cisco. For example, Duo has this device house. They can detect the device was into abnormal state. Then they can send us a signal, say, hey, the user, we want a user relogging. We have done this support using the CAPE. It's also part of the OpenID protocol level, right? Once we receive the event, we will mapping those to some of our identity event as well, revoke the tokens, ask the user to relogging, etc. So you can see, so this is nearly even within us, but if we can push that to a broader service providers, where all service providers can have the standard solution, this will be even better for the customer, so we can have the consistent behavior for all the service user have across domains.
Well, thank you, Qingwen. We looked a little bit more further into the shared signal drafts for things like account disabled, and we'd like to draw your attention to this a little bit. There is a reason attribute. It's optional, by the way. And really, they only have 2 suggested values for it, but you'll notice that neither of those suggested values have anything to do with the identity lifecycle states that we just mentioned. And so, and it's also possible values. It's not, definitive either. So it's interesting how that standard is that way. The things to take away from this session are SCIM v.next truly, we all can agree, needs a recoverable delete and possibly also an archive, quite likely. Standardizing states, and I truly can hardly believe that we haven't done this already, will help us all interoperate and make better decisions collectively amongst our various cross-domain situations. And also, this overlap in our proposed SCIM standardized states that we're talking about in shared signals can possibly be brought together and make both standards a lot more rich, especially regarding the user identity lifecycle. So really happy that you're here today. And we're on the SCIM working group, and we need more industry voices to participate in these thoughts and provide us feedback. We welcome you. You're all the best experts in the world, and we need your participation to make SCIM a much richer, better standard in the future. So please join us in the IETF in doing so. Even if you don't want to write the pen, it's okay. Danny and I have the authoring pen. You can just give us your feedback. We'll try to get your thoughts into the standard. And wait, there's more. If you loved this session, the next session is What's New in the Zoo in SCIM, coming up next in this same room. Hang on to your seats, and that's the next presentation. Thank you so much for listening to us today, and we hope you'll participate. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone, for joining the presentation.